Alright, you're looking at a human brain. The front of the brain is over here, and the back of the brain is over here. You're looking at the brain from the top view. So this would be the right hemisphere, and this would be the left hemisphere. You'll notice some of the blood vessels can be seen in the back here. They've been removed in these regions of the brain. The surface of the brain is called the cerebral cortex, and it is what we're going to principally concern ourselves with. The folding here, all these grooves, allows more brain tissue to be packaged into the limited volume of the skull. So let's take a look at just the left hemisphere from the side view. And here we see a map of the left hemisphere. Now the words here indicate what each brain region is involved in, what kind of task or process. And brain scientists have discovered the map here of the brain using three basic techniques. And they're summarized in this slide. First, you can examine the symptoms of people with brain damage. So for example, trauma to the back of the brain here can produce blindness. And so if damaging this brain area produces blindness, then we conclude that this brain region is normally processing vision when it is intact. Second kind of evidence is that you can record the electrical activity from a brain area to see when that area is being used. For example, take a look at this purple area here. It says sensations of touch, pain, and temperature. If we measure brain activity here, and by that we mean the electrical activity of the brain, and we'll see that brains are composed of brain cells that are electrically excitable. So when are these brain cells activated? When somebody is experiencing some kind of stimulation to their skin. It could be a touch or a pressure or temperature or pain to some part of their body, and then this part of the brain becomes active. Or if the person is hearing, exposed to sound in the environment, this part of the brain is active when they're involved in hearing something. If a person is speaking, this part of the brain is engaged. The third kind of evidence is when you stimulate a certain brain area, then you can see what happens to the person. So for example, if you stimulate the region of the brain in the back here, people report that they will see spots of light, for example. So they can have their eyes closed and you stimulate here and they will report spots of light. If you stimulate the sensory area, they'll report sensations on their skin at different locations on the body. This strip of brain tissue here is sort of like a brain map of the surface of your body. So you have a map of your body in your brain. If you stimulate this area over here at basic movements, different parts of the body will move. So this brain region seems to control our voluntary muscles. Stimulating one area might move the hand, stimulating a different area might move the leg, etc. Stimulating yet another area might move the face or the mouth. So all of your voluntary muscles are controlled by this area of the brain. So this map then was created by using those three kinds of techniques over decades of brain research. If you look at a real brain down here, you see you can't really sort of tell what any particular part of the brain is doing. You have to use these techniques to infer the function of different parts of the brain. Now brains are made up of units, living cells called neurons. Here's a cartoon example of a neuron. There are three basic parts of a neuron. You have the cell body, where the nucleus would be, and the nucleus would be DNA. The cell body has extensions coming off of it called dendrites. We'll see that these dendrites are the receiving zone of the neuron. Other brain cells are going to make connections to this brain cell at the location of these dendrites, as well as the cell body. And then coming out of the cell body is a long extension, a long fiber called the axon, and it is the output cable, you might say, of the neuron. The neuron, if it is sufficiently excited by all of its inputs, all of the activity of other neurons that are converging on this one cell, then this cell may decide, metaphorically, to generate electrical signals which will be sent down the axon to the terminal. So this is the basic structure of a neuron. Now neurons can come in different shapes. Here are some examples. All of these are neurons. They all have the three basic parts: the cell body, dendrites, and an axon with a terminal at the end. The axon, you'll notice in some of these, can branch into multiple terminals. Now, real neurons look like this under the microscope. So here we see a neuron has been stained with a certain fluorescent chemical, and when you shine certain kind of light on it, it fluoresces like this, and so you can see the cell body and the extensive dendrites. And the axon would be one of those small ones coming out of the cell body, and we don't see the terminal. In this cell over here, we have two clusters of dendrites. The cell body is in the middle, and this tiny, tiny little thin fiber there, that's the axon. That goes off somewhere, can't see, again, the terminal. So neurons are the basic building blocks of brains, and they have three basic parts: the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon. In this case, the cell body, the dendrites here, and the axon is this little thin one. In brains, though, we have billions of neurons, so they're going to be connected together in complicated networks. But it's not random the way brain cells are hooked up. They're hooked up in definitely organized ways so as to carry out different functions, different computations, you might say. Here we see part of the visual cortex, and again, neurons have been stained, so now they appear sort of dark black, I guess you would say, or dark purple, and you can see the extensive network of dendrites, and it looks like a forest. Now let's take a moment to go back to our map of the brain. We want to think of brains as an information processing system. So the brain is going to receive information about the world and then use that information to generate adaptive behavior. If we take a look at the brain, let's just, for our purposes here, divide the brain into the back half. So right now I'm outlining what we're going to call the back half of the brain. In fact, let me get some drawing tools here. Alright, and we'll do the line. And so right now I'm going to try to draw down here. Whoops, no, I don't want a line. I want freehand. Here we go. So right now I'm outlining what we're going to call the back half of the cortex. Not going to include the cerebellum down here. We're just going to be interested in the cortex. So I drew a line down here separating the sensation area and the movement area. And we'll say that this is the back half of the brain. And so consequently, this line down here, if we go around here, whoops, this is going to be the front half of the brain. Now if you take a look at what the back half seems to be involved in, we're going to see a general pattern here. We've got the visual area, we've got hearing, we've got touch. So three of the main sensory areas are located in the back. This recognition area down here is visual recognition. So much of the brain is involved in vision. To recognize something, we have to have stored memories of things that we've seen so that we can recognize them. So the word memory is also down here. Now this part of the brain up here is also a visual area, but it's vision for action. In other words, there's a map of our body here, the purple region here, and so this area here is involved in helping us situate ourselves, our bodies, within space. So when we see things, we can make a computation. Where is that object in relation to our bodies? So you can kind of get a sense of this. This is sort of in between the visual area and the sensory map of our body. And what the brain is doing here is making a computation of our body in space, in visual space, so that we can adjust how we reach for objects and we know where they are relative to our body. We've got hearing here, and we've got a very important language area here. So this area seems to be critically involved in understanding both written and spoken language. We'll come back to that. This emotions word down here, they're really referring to a structure underneath the cortex called the amygdala. We'll come to that a little later. But emotions are, of course, an important part of our mental life. Well, if the back part of the brain then is processing three of our major senses as well as comprehension of language, then what we can sort of say is the back of the brain is involved in answering the question, what is happening in the world? So it is processing information from the world, whether it be touch, sound, light hitting our eyes, or somebody is speaking to us, or we're reading. We are getting information from the world. And so we can answer that question, sort of what's happening in the world, what's happening to us. Now, on the other hand, the front part of the brain has regions that seem to be involved in a different type of task. We have the movement system here. We have speech production, thinking, judgment or decision making, feelings, which of course are very important for making decisions. So it's as if the front part of the brain is involved in what should I do. So the back part of the brain is going to compute what's happening in the world, and then these brain regions are going to communicate with brain regions in the front of the brain so as to come up with some kind of plan of action, and then we behave. We might say something, speech areas. We might move our body. And of course, we might be making a decision before we do any of those types of things. So we want to think of the brain as an information processing system. The brain gets inputs from the sensory organs, and it processes what's happening in the world, and then that information is going to be used to make adaptive decisions and then to act in the world, to behave in the world. Well, if the whole brain is an information processing system, and the brain is composed of units, brain cells called neurons, we're also then going to think of, where's our neurons? I need to get rid of this. Okay, so if a brain is an information processing system, and they're made of neurons, neurons also are information processing systems, just smaller ones. So a brain is composed of 100 billion neurons, but each neuron is also processing information. The information it processes is received on the dendrites by receiving connections from other brain cells. Maybe as many as 1,000 or 10,000 other brain cells can make connections to any given brain cell. The cell body is going to, in a sense, integrate all that incoming information from different brain cells, and it will possibly generate an output electrical signal, which will travel down the length of the axon to the terminals. So a brain cell is also an information processor. It gets inputs, it makes a decision, it integrates that information, and then generates an output electrical signal. Now what happens at the terminal here, terminals is important here. On this slide, by the way, here we just have a summary of some of the functions of the basic parts of the neuron. But let's find out what happens at the terminals. In this diagram we drew, here we see the dendrites, the cell body, the axon, and the terminal. When the electrical signal reaches the terminal, chemicals are released from the terminal. These chemicals cross this space. It's filled with fluid, but they diffuse, they move across this space, and they interact with the target cell. When those chemicals interact with the target cell, they begin to generate another electrical signal in the target cell. So the function of the chemicals is to sort of transmit activity from this cell and transmit that activity to the next cell that it's connected with. That junction there is called a synapse. And the purpose of the chemicals is to convey a message, to relay a message to the target cell. The chemicals will generate electrical signals in the target cell, and the target cell can carry that electrical signal down its axon to its terminal and influence whatever cell is next in line. So we have here then what we'll call communication between neuron 1 and neuron 2. It's a form of communication because the activity of this neuron 1 is going to be influencing the activity of neuron 2. Now here we see just one cell making a synapse on the target cell, but remember there may be 1,000 other terminals that are located along all over these dendrites. So these dendrites are just branches that create more space for synapses from other neurons. In this slide, we summarize the chemistry of neurons.